Welcome to another episode of Crops TV. We're excited to have you here today, and I'm extremely happy that we've invited Stanley Culpepper, an extension weed scientist with the University of Georgia, here to join us. And Stanley has a long history with the University of Georgia and a substantial expertise in this area of the Endangered Species Act and how it interacts with our pesticide applications. So, Stanley, thank you for joining us here today.
Certainly a pleasure to be here today to really talk about a dynamic and challenging topic. Really, my title is the Endangered Species Act, Family Farms in Our Environment, but it's really about the weed management toolbox. And it doesn't matter if you're in Georgia, you're in Iowa, you're in California. Our weed management toolbox is really threatened by two dynamic challenges. Weed resistance is something that every weed scientist has been focused on for quite a while. And the other one that I would argue maybe today is even more impactful are the regulatory concerns with many of the tools that face these challenges that are currently in our toolbox. And I'm going to take the time today, and I'm really going to hopefully bring you up to date on where we're currently sitting from the Endangered Species Act and its potential interaction on family farms and our environment. Now, I do want to be honest. I am from a bicentennial family farm. I am very biased for that farm, but as a University of Georgia scientist, I'm going to spend much of my effort today sharing with you sound scientific ideas of how we can cooperate and come together to work through the Endangered Species Act on our family farms. Now, most of you are probably aware now because this issue's been getting some significant focus over the last year or year and a half, but just to give you a little bit of background, the Endangered Species Act was actually implemented by Congress in 1973. This act was really developed to provide the framework to conserve and protect endangered and threatened species, and very important if you're a weed scientist like I am, their habitats. So if you have an endangered bee or butterfly, it's not only the bee or the butterfly, it's those plants that provide the habitat or the nourishment for those species to survive. It's also very important to understand there are approximately, keyword there, approximately 1,800 species that are either endangered or threatened and 900 critical habitats across our country. So with this effort, you think about endangered species and what our entire lives, we've seen on the nightly news how a cute or cuddly endangered species could be potentially threatened by, let's call it progress. Maybe it's building a road, building a dam, putting houses up, in the South now putting the Buc-ee's up. All of these potential movements in progress destroy the habitat of these species and potentially threaten them, and they have to be protected. But the real question has been, what about production agriculture? Where does the Endangered Species Act interact with production agriculture and the practical use of pesticides to control troublesome pests? And that's really what we're going to talk about today, because this has the potential of impacting every single farm in our country. So most of you hopefully are very aware that pesticides are regulated by the US EPA. And when we talk about pesticides, for example, we have herbicides. Herbicides control plants, hopefully the weeds we want to control, but they control plants, right? Insecticides control insects, etc. Well, these herbicides don't know if a troublesome weed in our field is any different than an endangered species, right? So these products that we use potentially could harm some of these endangered or threatened species if they come in interaction with one another. So with the EPA registering and re-registering pesticides, which is obviously very important for us to get new tools in the toolbox and also to make sure older tools have the latest science when it comes to application procedures, when it comes to our safety applying them, consumer safety and environmental safety, we're making sure everything is in order through a scientific process. So it's very important. But when the EPA registers or re-registers a pesticide, they are required by law that when an endangered or threatened species are potentially harmed by a pesticide, that law requires consultation with the services. Now, those of us in agriculture, we're very familiar with the EPA, but we're maybe not that familiar with the services. The services really is U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the National Marine Fisheries Services. So now if the EPA is re-registering your favorite herbicide, and it potentially harms one of these endangered or threatened species, the EPA has to consult with the respective one of the services to determine a pathway forward of hopefully continuing to use the tool while protecting the wildlife species of importance. So what has happened? Because I just told you the Endangered Species Act was basically signed about 50 years ago in December. And now all of a sudden, this is such a big deal across agriculture. Well, to be very clear, what has changed is lawsuits have changed. And the bigger fact, those of us in agriculture that love agriculture, we are losing the lawsuits. And the reason for this is, and I'll give you an example. This is not a factual example, but a group might take one of our favorite products to court and suggest to the judge that the EPA is not following the law when they registered or re-registered that pesticide. And in fact, they didn't follow the law as required by the Endangered Species Act. Well, if the judge looks over at the EPA, says, did you follow this law? And the EPA says, no, we did not follow this law. Then obviously we're going to lose. And this is what's been happening with the potential of having many of our product registrations or re-registrations vacated. Currently, about 95% of our pesticides are actually vulnerable. And we're in December of 2023 recording this, but just last week, the Ninth Circuit Court basically went in and vacated an Environmental Protection Agency decision on an antibiotic for citrus, right? So this is very important. There's one example. Another example, if you want to go back and do your homework, is go in and search the megasuit. The megasuit is really what has got us into the situation where our products are vulnerable because they have not been addressed in regards to the requirements of the Endangered Species Act when they're going through registration or re-registration. So where we find ourselves really is a dilemma. And I say we, I'm referring to those of us in agriculture. So we've got this dilemma of the court could remove our tools. That would be absolutely devastating to the toolbox. That would be absolutely devastating to every single one of us that is engaged in conventional agriculture. We have to work with the agency, the EPA. We have to work with the agency to make sure that we get our tools out of the court system and those decisions that are made by the court systems. And that is very important for all stakeholders in agriculture to be engaged in. But at the same time, when these issues are being addressed, they're being addressed very quickly. And sometimes so quickly they're being addressed without really, really sound science, which equals overwhelming regulations. All right. And I want to give you just a couple of examples of overwhelming regulations that are already in place as a result of this process. Now, most of you woke up as I did almost 2 years ago now when the Enlist One and Enlist Duo labels came out. I'm going to give you an example for Georgia. Obviously, I'm more familiar with Georgia, but when I woke up, the Enlist Duo label, that newly provided label, had 11 counties in Georgia where I could not, or none of my growers could apply Enlist Duo. And they couldn't do that because they needed to protect these two endangered salamander species on the left of your screen. Now, I will stress to you, this is county-wide. Think about this now. This is an endangered or threatened species, and we have county-wide restrictions. All right, I'm going to come back to that in a minute or two, but think about that. That is in place today. Another example of what is in place today is many of you, if you're on our family farms across America, you're aware of the Endangered Species Act, basically dicamba, in-crop field buffers, right? Your XtendiMax, your Ingenia, your Tavium. We have, if you're in a county that is deemed where you have to protect endangered species, I have 9 of those counties in Georgia, essentially. We have a 310-foot downwind buffer and a 57-foot omnidirectional buffer. And I'm giving you an example of an actual field that we work in. And this field is 63 acres. With a 310-foot downwind buffer, that accounts for 16 of those acres I've got highlighted in red. 57-foot omnidirectional buffer, 8 acres highlighted in blue. So we can't legally treat 38% of this field because of the buffers that are currently in place and on their labels. And what is frustrating to me as a scientist, the species that we're protecting with this restriction is a meadow root. Well, we know through the mapping process here in Georgia, the closest meadow root plant, historically noted, is over 30 minutes away. So again, when I talk about overly restrictive regulations being placed on us, it is already happening. And it's just the beginning if we do not engage in this process. So you may wonder, we're talking about endangered species. Where are the top 15 states located? There's no doubt Hawaii is in significant trouble with the potential of using pesticides as we move forward, but you can see California, Alabama, Florida, and Tennessee make out the top 5. I'm at number 7. You don't see your state. You might say, wow, that's really, really good news. But there are 2 ways to look at this. Number 1, that is good news. But let me share with you a slide my technician actually made. This is what we're sharing here is the counties with threatened and endangered species are highlighted in gold in your state. The counties not with endangered or threatened species are highlighted in white. All right, so what you see is the potential for every single farming operation, not only in your state, not only in my state, but across most of the country to be impacted by these regulations. So do not feel like you will not be impacted because the potential is very significant. Now, where are we at today? This is very important because this is actually a very good time to understand what is going on. So this past summer, several very important documents were released by the US EPA. The EPA's work plan has been out and it's available if you want to go back and look at that. But this summer, the EPA's Vulnerable Species Pilot Project and their herbicide strategy was released. I think herbicide strategy is over 1,000 pages. So it's some really, really good reading if you want to go back and read it. But here's what is important. What is important in these documents is we can see and somewhat interpret what the EPA is thinking and the process and the way they would suggest that we move forward. Now, I'm going to stress to you, this is my opinion and my opinion only. But if the EPA's proposed vulnerable species and or herbicide strategy go into action, and I mean we on the family farm, are done in regards to having a toolbox with tools with practical use patterns. That word practical use patterns is very, very important. But in my opinion, we are absolutely done. Now, at the same time, I say that it's also very important that you understand this is proposed. All right, this is where we must be engaged. And again, I stress we as all agriculture stakeholders must be engaged. We all play a role to potentially address this issue. And I want to also stress it's important to understand who are the true environmentalists on this planet in our country. It is agriculture. Who provides the habitat for most of these species? Who provides the habitat for wildlife in general? Okay, there are a lot of federal farms out west, but in general, it is our family farms. All right, so again, keep in mind we must be engaged. Now, what most people would do in a presentation like this is they would talk to you about all the things that have been proposed by the EPA. I'm simply not going to do that. The reason I'm not going to do that is because if they go through again, I don't think we have a toolbox. I don't think I have a family farm, right? So I think I would rather spend my time investing in what we can and maybe should be doing to help move this process along with the goal of protecting the family farm. You have to protect the family farm if you want to protect the habitat for the species. They are directly correlated. So protect the farm, you get to protect the species by doing that. And I'm going to highlight what I call my 6 main pillars of activity. There are 1,000 bullet points under each of these that we could go through, but today I just want to kind of give an overview. I'll start up top. Courts. We absolutely must help getting the decision impacting the ability to use these tools on our farms out of the court system. Bottom line, we have to do whatever it takes to get it out of the court. We need the discussion to be science-based, clearly. The next step I think I want to talk about is location of the species and the habitat, right? So if you're going to require us on the farm to protect these species, you should at least know where those species are at. Now, let's be clear. You and I are never going to know where these species are at, but the people regulating us, they should know where the species is at. At that same time, they need to know where our farm fields are at, right? If you don't know where our farm fields are at that we're potentially using a pesticide, and you don't really know where the species is at, you can't get the overlap to understand where we potentially harm wildlife when we're controlling pests in our crop, right? So let me expand on that before we move forward. All right, so I want to share with you some mapping objectives that we've been doing at the Georgia ESA pilot program. The goal of this program was really to increase the quality and quantity of information available to the US EPA and the services just so they can make better decisions. I always like to stop here and say, throughout my 24-year career, agriculture has never been afraid of good decisions based on science. What goes wrong for agriculture is when decisions are based or made without science, or you often hear the term best available science. Best available science may not mean good science at all. So again, if those decisions are made and you don't have good science, agriculture loses. And that's what we really want to prevent from happening with the Endangered Species Act process. So I want to take you through two steps. I want to take you through an objective we had to define exactly where the species are located, and I'm going to give you an example. And I want to show you defining how we're defining exactly where our farm fields are located and how important that is. And again, this is such a team effort. I'm here talking to you today. Team, team, team. Farmers are involved. The Department of Agriculture is involved. My colleagues are involved. We're cooperating with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the U.S. EPA. So it's a true team effort. Now, one of our projects I mentioned Enlist Duo was removed from 11 counties in corn, cotton, and soybean in Georgia. All right, and I'm going to show you and contrast three mapping processes and the impact that they potentially have. But sitting here today, I'll bring your attention to the far left. That is one of the 11 counties. It's Worth County, but that county represents all of the counties where we today cannot use Enlist Duo in any county. That accounts for 951,557 acres of potential crops. I cannot use that tool today. Now, in the mapping process, instead of completely removing the whole county from use, if the regulators had taken the approach of let's use the historical habitat of these salamander species, because again, this is to protect the salamander. If you look in the middle picture, what you see is that red area highlighted up toward the top. That is the historical habitat of the salamander. Now, keep in mind, I can't use the herbicide across the entire county. The little pink areas or purplish areas, they are farm fields. So they are potential areas that I could use this tool to help a family farm, but I can't do it. But if we'd have used historical habitat, information provided historically, we would have had to protect 69,167 acres instead of 951,000. That would have been an admirable approach to protect these species. But we didn't like that either. Working with Fish and Wildlife, man, the group that we're working with is phenomenal. They're outstanding people. We actually created new maps for the two salamander species. And with these new maps, they're based on science. They're based on input from experts that understand the species like I kind of understand a cotton crop, which is really, really powerful. And although you can't see red or highlighted areas in the right picture across the 11 counties, there's 3,526 acres. So this is one example of how we can work together to provide sound science to have a positive impact to not only protect agriculture, but to actually identify where the species is at and protect that species. And I think this is something that we need to do. Now, I need to stress, every situation won't go from 951,000 acres to 3,000 acres, but it's the concept of using the science to get it right, then empowers us to do a better job. And I do want to stress, there is a dynamic team led by the US EPA currently working to see if this approach can be expanded nationally. And I think everybody that's involved in this team is phenomenal, and they should be absolutely celebrated for the effort. We'll have to see the impact from that. Now, while we were mapping the species in Georgia and looking for the salamanders, I want to bring your attention here. In this scenario, the sensitive site is highlighted in red, and you see some of that in the top left. That's basically where I have a farm field that I could treat with Enlist Duo, and I have a salamander species that is potentially vulnerable for that treatment that I need to come up with a good plan to protect. But I actually want to bring your attention down to what I have circled in red. You see a lot of the purplish fields, the cropland fields. Now, you can't tell how big these fields are because you don't know what the scale is. But these are actually really, really small fields. And in fact, when you zoom in, what you actually see is these fields are in the middle of an established community that has been there for over 30 years. And what is unique with this one is it actually overlaps with our salamander species. So it kicks out as we're potentially harming a species by treating these fields that are not fields. Now, in the 11 counties in Georgia, we've actually gone in and we call these fields that aren't really fields spurless pixels. And we've given you an example on the table on the right. So the first column is the corn, cotton, and soybean acres when you include what the current process is. And kudos to USDA and the cropland data layer that they do. It is amazing. We just have to work together to address these rogue pixels. But if you look, for example, at Burke County, I have 109,000 acres of corn, cotton, and soybean with the pixel. But if I get rid of the pixel, that's 8,000 acres that are supposedly potentially treated with a pesticide that aren't really farm fields. And that's a big deal because these fields often end up in the areas in the state where the species that we need to protect are actually living, and their habitat is very important. All right. Again, I'm blessed to say there's a dynamic team led by U.S. Fish and Wildlife that is working to address this challenge. We brought it to their attention. They're respecting it. They're looking at it. Again, we'll have to wait and see what the outcome is. But this is the way you can use science to have impact. All right, now once we know where the species is at, we know where our fields are at, there are going to be some of us that need to further address the concern. Now, when the US EPA is determining how sensitive a species is, an endangered or threatened species is, to the pesticides you're applying, it's really, really dynamic. But I want to hit on 2 points of that process. The beginning point of the process is what rate of a pesticide do you use, right? The rate that you put in your sprayer directly influences the endpoint toxicity. That's a big word for the EPA. Endpoint toxicity. How toxic is it where your product potentially ends up that may overlap with one of these species? All right. So the rate we put in is very important. The other one that's very important is how sensitive is an endangered species to the products we apply. So let's just expand on those for just a second. All right. Now, the question I have is, are practical pesticide use rates and application patterns used in the process? Are they practical? Here's an example from the vulnerable species document that you can go look. I'm going to bring your attention down to where I've got highlighted diuron and glyphosate, 2 very important products in my part of the world in the crops that I work. If you look, it says this is the single maximum rate used to estimate exposure for these products. So what they're assuming in this specific package is diuron is used at 6.4 pounds of active ingredient per acre. Now, you may or may not use diuron in your operation, but we use it on most of our cotton fields. We usually use less than a pound of product in many of our situations, right? So my point is the rate that they're assuming that we're using to put in the model to estimate endpoint toxicity does not represent what we're actually doing in the field. And you can see right below there, every one of you are familiar with glyphosate and Roundup, but they're assuming 8 pounds is what we apply when we go out and we spray our soybean or we spray our cotton, etc. All right, so clearly that highlights something that's very important. Now remember, it's the registrant's label. It is not the EPA's label. It is the registrant's label. We need label reform. We need accurate use rates in a way that does not hurt agriculture, does not hurt a farmer, but it needs to be accurate for the modeling process, and we need accurate application patterns. And oh, by the way, we completely need label reform where we can update to e-labels. We can have uniform structure. How cool would it be knowing every herbicide, every label that you look at, number 5 on that label in the table of contents is whatever you want it to be, carryover. Number 5 on every label is always carryover. Number 6 is always PHI. We have got to make better labels that improve communication, which will directly influence pesticide stewardship, which is really the ultimate goal. Now, the next thing I wanted to mention, how do we know how sensitive an endangered species is to a pesticide? Well, we don't. If I go out and I screen an endangered species to a bunch of herbicides, I'm going to be under the jail, right? So what we currently do is what I would say not where we need to be. We often, and I'm giving you an example on the screen. Here's an example of Coley's meadow rue that's in North Florida and South Georgia. That plant I have to protect when I'm applying dicamba. But they actually use the sensitivity of soybeans and dicamba in the equation of determining how far that buffer needs to be to protect the meadow rue. So again, we can come up with surrogate species that much more closely are related to the endangered species where we can actually screen and understand how sensitive they are to various products. We can do that. That's what we do every day. We just have to come together and justify this as a need. But it would change the game, absolutely change the game. At the end of the day, we're going to have places we have to protect. There are going to be places where our farm fields overlap with these species. And we, as true environmentalists on the farm, have to work together to mitigate the potential exposure, to make sure we keep the tools in the toolbox, but at the same time protect the wildlife. And that's something that we respect the opportunity to be engaged in. But the decisions need to be fair, and they need to be based on sound science and common sense, right? Now, I'm going to share with you two real mitigation movements, again, driven by the ESA and herbicide strategy by the US EPA. We have spray drift mitigation, and then we have runoff erosion mitigation. Let's first talk about spray drift mitigation. And this slide is from US EPA's herbicide strategy document information. All right, I've added the red box because I want to bring your attention. They are proposing or expecting buffers in general would range from 200 to 300 feet for aerial applications and 1 to 200 feet for ground applications. Now, I'm struggling a little bit here as a weed scientist because I've already got a 310 downwind plus 57 on 3 products that I currently are used by our growers. But again, if you go with the benefit of the doubt and you say it's going to end up with 1 to 200 feet buffers. All right, so if this ends up to be in-field buffers, the level of impact is overwhelming. So what I'm sharing with you here is what we will call a best case scenario and a worst case scenario for 2 different downwind buffer distances. Let's focus on the 110 foot downwind buffer distance. In a best case scenario, large fields, a lot of you guys, less interaction with potential habitat of the species, we're still going to lose about 10% of the actual land if that is an in-field buffer with a 110 foot downwind buffer. Worst case scenario, like our family farm in northeastern North Carolina, I'm going to lose 15% of the field to be able to legally treat that. If you go to 240 foot, you can see it's 20 to 33%. There's no way our family farms can be sustainable if we have to give up 10, 20, 30% of our fields. It's simply not a reasonable solution, and it's not the solution that science says we have to abide by. There are other options for us. And this isn't a perfect example of where we have to be engaged in agriculture. I mentioned the EPA has proposed their information. We are also blessed. While they propose their information, they ask for our input. They don't have to do that. So kudos to them for letting us be engaged. So this is just an example of some of the things that we submitted, and there are many other people across the country that have submitted. And I'm not going to go through all of these, but I'm going to highlight 2 of them. I want education credit. All right, if you go to a training like this, I think training is the number one way to foster pesticide stewardship, because hopefully after we communicate, you want to put that product on target better than you ever have before, and you understand why, right? So if we have a 150 foot buffer, we should deserve a credit to cut that buffer down to 75 feet. Making that up, that's just an example. Then I'm going to bring your attention to the last one. Look at pesticide application number credit. All right, so why would this be important? I'm going to give you an example. I'm making this up again. Let's say we have glyphosate and we can make 4 applications in a cotton crop. That is not a good resistance management program. Keep that in mind. But let's say you can make 4 applications. Well, we're good stewards. We only make 2. Well, the modeling by the EPA assumes we use 4. So we're good stewards. We ran a good resistance program, but we're still have to abide by the rules and regulations based on 4. We deserve credit. Right? We deserve credit. We should get 50% credit or reduction on that buffer, right? So they're the kinds of discussions that are currently going. We're really optimistic and hopeful we can engage there. Runoff erosion mitigation. This is something, again, that's going to go on essentially every pesticide label we would expect. And there are 2 important things here, and I've got them highlighted. I'm actually going to start down at the bottom. Number of points would depend on the level of impact. So what is the number of points? Every pesticide is going to be given a point. Right now, we expect that to range from 1 to 9. If you have a 9, that means the EPA expects your product to move off field very easily relative to other products. Now, at the same time, you have, let's say, for example, let's say a product like dual magnum. That's a very important tool for us. I expect the number will be very high. We don't know, but I expect, let's say it has a 9. All right, so if I'm going to use dual magnum in my soybeans, in my cotton, in my tomatoes, possibly it could vary by crop. That's important. It could vary by crop, but let's say it's got a 9 across crops. All right, I have to come up with 9 points from the mitigation menu. All right, this is a menu that is being provided really by the agency. They're going to give you 1 point for low efficacy. So we would need 9 low efficacy mitigation measures to be able to use that product. Or we would need high efficacy, get 3 points. We would need 3 of those to meet the criteria required. Now, you can go ahead and look at what the EPA is proposing. Again, from herbicide strategy slides from the EPA, here's an example of what they had or provided at the time, as well as the points that are provided. Now, there are 2 things that are very important here. You need to look at this. You need to think about what works for you, but you also need to think about what you're doing that is not on this list, because we need to get it on the list. Now, it's very important. You can't just say, hey, EPA, add so-and-so to the list. We've got to have the science behind it. If you have a great idea, we don't have the science behind it, that's job for folks like myself. We go out and we get the science, we get it fixed eventually, right? So you have to be engaged. The other thing we have to do is we have to get more points for some of these mitigations. I'm going to go to cover crops. Cover crops may or may not be important up in your part of the world, but they are for us. There's data that we have right now on reflex or flomethicin. If we grow the right cover crop, we can reduce runoff by 98%. The data is published. The data is presented to the EPA. But in reality, what you have is some cover crops that may only deserve 1 and some cover crops that deserve 3 points of credit. So we need a category. We need an option, right? We need provided you get 1 point if you do this, you get 3 points if you do that. We need this menu to allow flexibility for us to initiate on every farm. Remember, there are no 2 farms in America that are exactly the same. No 2. We are all unique. We are all different in some ways. So we need a lot of flexibility to implement that in there. Now, as I'm getting ready to finish up, I just want to stress to you that the Endangered Species Act is a huge, huge challenge, huge concern, tremendous amount of cooperation going into trying to resolve the issue to protect the farm and to protect the wildlife. That is something that we need to state. It's very clear. But we have to make sure the availability of economically effective pesticides are available for our family farms. And for those of us who in weed control, we don't get a lot of new chemistry. Preserving old chemistry is very, very important. But to each of you, if you're a pesticide applicator, you have to respect the fact that you must ensure every application you make goes on target and stays there. Once you do that, then we as scientists need to confirm that you're doing that. That is powerful, and that's something that we can use. The list of herbicides down at the bottom may or may not be important to you, but that's 8 herbicides in my area that currently face very, very, very significant challenges. And we're working hard to overcome those. The last thing that I want to mention, you have to be prepared. We're in a difficult situation now, and this is my opinion and my opinion only. There is no fact to this at all, but I think you have to get ready, because this is just the beginning of some significant challenges. When the U.S. Fish and Wildlife moves the monarch butterfly to a threatened status, then I think we have an even more challenging scenario at hand because of the perception that butterfly carries to the general public, right? And we have to be engaged and make sure people understand how important family farm sustainability is to each of these species if they are to survive. So with that said, it's cooperation, it's communication, and at least with me, it's science. We have to make the decisions based on science. The only way you get good science is working together, working across states, working across crops, working across all of our organizations and stakeholders. So with that, I hope you guys have an amazing and productive 2024 season, and best wishes for you.
Thank you, Stanley. That was just really insightful and a lot of information, I think, for everybody to take in. We'll probably have some people watch this a couple times, I think. But I have a couple questions. Would you be willing to answer maybe a couple questions for me?
Absolutely. I'll try.
So, I mean, I understand that this is all relative to protection of endangered species, right? But there's also, like you've mentioned a couple times, protection of the family farm and the use of tools, and not only the ability to use them, but to use them in a way that works for us, especially in my mind, and I'm sure in yours from a resistance management standpoint. And I know on your mitigation measures list, and then in a couple other places, we've seen things like reducing herbicide rate. We know that, or reducing product rate, I guess. It could be any pesticide as a strategy. So as you sort of look forward to how this is going to look maybe 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, do you expect that these measures will inherently change the way we farm, not only from maybe making applications themselves challenging, but also increasing resistance of our pests?
So that is a really dynamic question, and obviously you know your subject, right? So here's what I hope. You know, I think I can admit this again. Let me stress before I get attacked. I am from a family farm. The farm's been established, believe it or not, since 1772. Right. So I live and die and breathe the family farm. But there are a few things that we do on the farm that we need to do better. Right. And especially in terms of pesticide stewardship. So if there are some things on the mitigation menus that actually make us better, make us protect our farm, make us protect the wildlife that's on our land better, we need to be open to that, right? I've never met a farmer that wants a pesticide to move off target. So if we can help that farmer through people just like you, put that product on target, stay on target, that makes them money. It might make them money on pest control. It might make them money on better resistance management programs. It might make them money if they're growing trees beside a cotton crop, right? Because now the tree production is up. So really, that's what we as scientists, I feel like we're in the middle, and what we have to do is engage with the regulatory agency, engage with agriculture, and we have to figure out a way to make both work. Right? Let's bring the new ideas, the new tools that make us on the farm better and more sustainable, that are economically viable and economically beneficial, and then work with the EPA to make sure that's the mitigation measures, and they're the ones that we're allowed to implement. So will it? Yes, I hope we change. I hope we continue to get better. But what I also hope is the tools in the toolbox, and we can't stress enough, and I know you understand what I'm talking about, but the practical use of these tools is threatened more than the complete loss of them. We have to make sure that these tools are practical in the use pattern for us to remain sustainable. And again, I'll stress, you know, you and I do impact statements. I just did my impact statement. Well, the impact statement for a family farm is each family farm feeds 166 people for a year. All right. There's no impact statement greater than that. We have to protect these people.
Fantastic. Thank you. And one final question that I think maybe everybody who watches this presentation is wondering, and I know I am, is what ideas do you have for someone who is watching this presentation who wants their voice to be heard? I know that you have those ins with the EPA and the USDA, but what might the farmer or the seed dealer or the chemical salesperson do to get their voice heard?
So that's also one of the most important things that we could ever discuss. And before I answer your question, let me put back to you. Think about the people that are making the decisions on our tools, right? Most of them are really young, highly intelligent people that are sitting in a cubicle in Washington, D.C. They've never been on a farm, right? They don't know what we do. They don't know how hard we work. They don't know how much these farmers cherish that land, right? They don't understand that. So what you're asking is so important because we have to be engaged. We have to help them understand who we are, what we do. So far, and I do this a lot, you know this, I do this a lot. I put regulators and farmers together. So far, I've never had a situation where the regulator didn't come back to me and say, wow, just wow, right? So it's important. Now, we can't have every regulator on every farm. So the other opportunity for us to do is to engage through comments and engage in exactly what you're talking about. So I would encourage you, if regardless of what state you're in, to work with Extension especially, right? Because I think Extension is a powerful conduit to work with all groups. But you can put your comments on your own. The EPA will cherish and respect and absolutely review your comments. But what I try to do in Georgia is I try to bring our growers in with our agents so we can work together to represent everybody. So either work as a team, individually is fine, but working as a team, then you have a better understanding of what the state and what agriculture needs. And right now in this situation, it's really about agriculture more than any one of us individually. So working in teams, working with the university, working with specialists, I would encourage that greatly. And even communicating with the registrants. It's very, very important. Remember, it's the registrant's label, it's the registrant's product. All right. That is very important for you to understand. So communicate with those guys. But somebody like you is exactly where I would go if I'm farming in that state.
Thank you, Stanley. I so appreciate you being here with us today. I think this was just an absolute wealth of information that's kind of coming at us like a freight train. So it's good that we're all informed and as involved as we can be. So I appreciate you joining us for another episode of Crops TV, and we'll see you another time.
Thank you so much. And again, wishing you guys a great 2024.